Story series, Until I Gained Confidence, My Journey to Learning English. Welcome to Smart English Start. In this series, we'll be sharing the journeys of different English learners, people who once struggled but found their own way to confidence. Each story is unique, but they all have one thing in common. They overcame their fears and learned to speak English fluently. Now, let's dive into today's story, Until I Gained Confidence, where we share how a single TV show changed everything for one English learner. Episode, Until I Gained Confidence, My Journey to Learning English.
Hello, my name is Takashi. I currently work in the United States and frequently travel around the world. English has become an essential tool. But things weren't always this way. In fact, I wasn't always fluent in English. There was a time when I could barely understand a conversation, let alone participate in one. If you struggle with confidence when speaking, then this story is for you. Today, I want to share my journey, how I went from knowing almost no English to using it every day. I hope to show you what it really means to learn a language and, more importantly, why confidence plays a key role in the process. I knew almost no English. I grew up in a small city in Osaka, Japan. Like most students, the only exposure I had to English was through school. In class, we learned phrases like, "This is a pen," and "How are you?" But I had no idea how to actually use them in a real conversation. To be honest, I never had much interest in English. It was just another subject, something I memorized for exams. I never imagined that speaking English would become such a big part of my future. So how did I go from that to where I am today? The answer lies in a turning point that changed everything. Moving to New York. My English learning journey truly began one day when my mother made a shocking announcement at the dinner table. "Takashi, your father has been transferred for work, and we're moving to New York next month." It felt like something out of a TV drama. At first, I thought she was joking. After all, I had spent my whole life in Japan, and I had never needed English outside of school. But when I saw my father's serious expression, I realized it was real. I felt completely lost. New York? Really? But I don't speak English. Up until then, life had been simple. I had my friends, my family, and my familiar surroundings. I never had to think about the future too much. I was just a regular student. And now, suddenly, all of that was about to change. How am I supposed to go to school if I can't speak the language? A flood of worries filled my mind. Arriving in New York. And just like that, we arrived in New York City. The first shock came at John F. Kennedy International Airport. Everything was in English, the announcements, the signs, the people's conversations. An airport staff member approached me and asked something. I had no idea what they were saying. I hesitated and finally said the only thing I could think of, yes. And the next day, school started. As I stepped into my new classroom, the teacher smiled at me and said, "Good morning, everyone. This is our new student from Japan. Please welcome him." Suddenly, every student in the room turned to look at me. I felt frozen. "Introduce yourself," the teacher said. But my mind went completely blank. What was I supposed to say? How should I say it? I stood there in silence for what felt like forever. Finally, I managed to say, in a shaky voice, "My name is Takashi." That was it. The students smiled politely, but inside, I felt like I had completely failed. The rest of the day passed in a blur. The teacher spoke, the students answered, but I couldn't understand anything. All I could do was look at the notebook of the student sitting next to me and copy whatever they wrote. That was my first day of school in America. An escape at home. After school, I went straight home, completely exhausted. My mother asked, "How was your first day?" I simply answered, "It was fine." Then, I went to my room and collapsed onto my bed. Will every day be like this? I didn't want to do anything. But out of habit, I reached for the TV remote and turned it on. Of course, there were no Japanese channels. I kept flipping through until something caught my eye. It was a sitcom, a group of 6 people sitting in a cafe, laughing and talking. It was Friends. Even though I couldn't understand most of the dialogue, something about it was comforting. And then, one character caught my attention. His name was Chandler Bing. He was sarcastic, awkward, and a little self-conscious, kind of like me. He said something that made me laugh, even though I didn't fully understand it. Could I be any more? I grabbed a notebook and wrote down the phrase. That night, for the first time since coming to New York, I felt a little less alone. And from that moment, I made a decision: I was going to watch Friends every day. A new routine. From that night on, watching Friends became part of my daily routine. Every evening after school, I would turn on the TV and watch an episode. At first, I could only understand a few words, but I kept watching. I liked the characters, and I wanted to understand what they were saying. I started to recognize certain phrases. The characters repeated them in different situations, and little by little, I began to understand their meaning. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was learning English naturally, just by listening and paying attention. Writing down new words. I kept a small notebook next to me while watching. Every time I heard a phrase I didn't understand, I would pause the show and write it down. One of the first phrases I wrote was, "How you doing?" It was something Joey said all the time. I didn't know exactly what it meant, but I could tell he used it to greet people in a funny way. Another phrase was, "Oh, my God." Janice, one of the side characters, always said this in a loud, dramatic voice. It made me laugh, and I remembered it easily. At school, I still couldn't speak much English, but I felt like I was making progress. I had a secret weapon, my friend's notebook. Shadowing without knowing. One day, I caught myself doing something strange. While watching the show, I started repeating some of the words out loud. I mimicked the characters' voices, their intonation, their expressions. Could I be any more? I said in my best Chandler impression. I wasn't trying to study, I was just having fun. But without realizing it, I was practicing pronunciation and rhythm. I later learned that this technique is called shadowing, a powerful way to improve speaking skills. At the time, I didn't know that. I was just copying the characters because it felt natural. My first real conversation. A few weeks after starting my friend's routine, something unexpected happened. At lunch, one of my classmates, Mike, sat at my table. He pointed at my notebook and asked, "What's that?" I panicked. My English was still terrible. But instead of freezing, I opened my notebook and pointed at something I had written, "How you doing?" Mike laughed. "Oh, you like Friends?" I nodded. Then, slowly, I said, "Yes. I watch, every day." He smiled. "Cool. Who's your favorite character?" I knew this question. I had heard it before. I took a deep breath and said, "I like Chandler. He is funny." It was a short conversation, but it was my first real conversation in English. For the first time, I felt like I could actually communicate. Using what I learned. I had been watching Friends every day for weeks. I wrote down new phrases, repeated them aloud, and even mimicked the characters' tones. But something was still missing. I wasn't actually using English in real life. One day, I decided to change that. At school, I sat next to Mike, the same classmate who had noticed my friend's notebook before. I took a deep breath and tried to start a conversation. "Hey, how you doing?" I said, imitating Joey's voice. Mike laughed. "Oh, that's Joey's line." For the first time, I felt a little more confident. Mike didn't expect perfect English. He just found it funny that I was using something from Friends. I smiled. Yes, I like Friends. I watch every day. It was a short exchange, but I had spoken English without fear. That moment changed everything. Overcoming the fear of mistakes. Before that conversation, I had been afraid of making mistakes. What if I said something wrong? What if people laughed at me? But when I spoke to Mike, I realized something: mistakes didn't matter as much as I thought. Mike didn't laugh at me, he laughed with me. He understood what I was trying to say, and that was all that mattered. From that day on, I decided to speak more, even if my sentences weren't perfect. I started small, just greetings or simple responses, but each time I spoke, I felt a little more comfortable. English wasn't just something I was learning in my head anymore. I was using it in real life. Expanding my English practice. Now that I had more confidence, I started looking for other ways to practice. One day after class, I went to a convenience store. When it was my turn at the register, the cashier said, "That'll be $5. I usually just nodded and handed over the money. But this time, I tried to say something. "Can I have a bag?" It wasn't a complicated sentence, but it was the first time I had spoken to a stranger in English. The cashier nodded and gave me a bag. It was a small victory, but to me, it felt huge. I had used English outside of school. After that, I started ordering food at restaurants by myself. I asked for directions when I needed them. I even tried answering questions in class. The more I practiced, the easier it became. The power of small wins. Each small success gave me the confidence to keep going. I had my first real conversation with a classmate. I spoke English at a store for the first time. I started using simple English in everyday life. Little by little, I was breaking free from my fear. I wasn't fluent yet. I still made mistakes. But I wasn't afraid of speaking anymore. That was the most important change of all. Breaking free from translation. I had reached a point where I could have basic conversations. I could ask for things, answer simple questions, and even joke a little with my classmates. But I still had one problem: I was thinking in Japanese first and then translating into English. Whenever I spoke, my brain would create the sentence in Japanese first. Then, I would search for the right English words. This made my speech slow and unnatural. I wanted to fix this. I wanted to start thinking directly in English. A new way to practice. One evening, I was watching Friends, as usual. But this time, I tried something different. Instead of just watching passively, I paused the episode after every few lines and tried to predict what the characters would say next. At first, I got most of it wrong. But the more I tried, the more I noticed certain patterns, how native speakers naturally form sentences. I also started describing things around me in English. For example, when I was on the subway, instead of thinking in Japanese, I tried to say it in English without translating. "It's really crowded on this train." At first, it was difficult. My brain kept switching back to Japanese. But with time, it became easier. The first time I spoke without thinking. One day, I was in class when the teacher asked a question. Normally, I would think of the answer in Japanese first, then try to translate it. But this time, before I could stop myself, I just said the answer in English. It was a simple response, but it came out naturally, without translation. I froze for a second. I realized that I had just spoken in English without thinking in Japanese first. That moment changed everything. Getting comfortable with English conversations. After that, I started using English more naturally. I stopped overthinking grammar and just spoke. I answered questions in class without hesitation. I had longer conversations with my classmates. One day, Mike and I were eating lunch when he said, "Dude, your English is getting really good." I laughed. Thanks, man. I still make a lot of mistakes, though. He shrugged. Yeah, but who cares? We all do. That was when I realized, English doesn't have to be perfect. As long as people understand me, that's all that matters. The big shift. I had finally reached a point where English felt comfortable. I wasn't translating in my head anymore. I wasn't afraid of making mistakes. For the first time, English felt like a part of my life, not just something I was studying. A conversation that changed everything. One evening, after months of speaking more English, something unexpected happened. Mike and I were sitting outside after school, just talking about random things. It was nothing special, just another conversation. We talked about school, music, and what we wanted to do in the future. At some point, he asked, "So, do you ever think about going back to Japan?" I started answering. "Yeah, sometimes. I mean, I love my family and friends there, but," and then, I froze. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I suddenly realized something incredible. I had been speaking for several minutes without thinking about English at all. No translating. No hesitation. Just talking naturally. Fluency wasn't what I expected. For the longest time, I thought fluency meant knowing every word and speaking perfect English. But that day, I learned the truth. Fluency isn't about being perfect. It's about being comfortable. It's when you stop thinking about English as a foreign language and just use it like any other skill. I wasn't perfect. I still made mistakes. But I didn't let those mistakes stop me anymore. That was the moment I knew I was fluent. Looking back on the journey. As I walked home that evening, I thought about how far I had come. At first, I couldn't even introduce myself. Then, I started learning from friends. I gained confidence through small conversations. I stopped translating and started thinking in English. And finally, I had my first real, natural conversation without effort. I had reached a point where English was part of my daily life. And the best part? I actually enjoyed speaking English now. The journey never ends. Even now, I'm still learning new words, improving my pronunciation, and discovering different ways to express myself. But I no longer feel afraid or embarrassed. If I don't know a word, I just ask. If I make a mistake, I laugh and move on. Learning a language isn't about reaching a final stage, it's about growing every day. So, if you're learning English, remember this: fluency isn't about being perfect. It's about using English without fear. Make mistakes. Keep practicing. Find something you love in English and enjoy the process. One day, you'll look back and realize you've become fluent without even noticing. And when that moment comes, you'll smile, just like I did.